it can't help. And believe me when I say everything that's going on across the country is, unfortunately, is happening right here in Monterey County.
Wow. And that was one of the things that made MAG so urgent to have this meeting, because some of the things that's going on across the country. I mean, we have one of the biggest and best schools here in Gainesville, a lot of influx of new people. Also, one of the best, smallest schools here in Gainesville, colleges. And a lot of people go in and out, but the people who grow up here and live here, they see things that some people don't see. And they live in places that they're caught in a cycle, and it goes on and on again. So, yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of the discussion. My third question would be, how can volunteers be used? Youth services, mentoring programs. Do you have a mentor coordinator?
No, we don't. We collaborate with other organizations. We can't do it all, and we don't try to. Yeah. We try to get people from our organizations to work with other organizations that's doing the same thing. We don't. I think one of the biggest problems in our county, we duplicate services. Yeah. If we will all come together and work for a common goal on the mentorship and other things, then perhaps we would be a little bit further. But we have so many little small organizations that sometimes we outwork ourselves. But no, we don't. We just like to work with groups like yours and others who have a program established. We welcome them. And I wasn't sure, but I brought this little book, and I'm sure you all have seen it, written by Michonne Walls. She is a law professor at the University of Florida. She wrote this little handbook some years back, and I think that every child that's in school should have a copy of it. It tells everything you need to know about from employment to addiction, education, what would happen to our children if they come into contact with any of these problems. So I think it's a good resource, and we have been trying to give it to as many students as possible. Parents, they need to read it and share it with their children, and that way a lot of the questions that you have asked today, and that parents who aren't here, if they would read this book and kind of just go over it with their children, perhaps we wouldn't have some of the problems that we're having now. Again, I thank MAG for having us, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Let me make sure everybody, does anybody want to answer anything further?
I just want to know if you could say the name of the book.
I have some copies. In fact, it's Your Future, Your Choice. And I have a few I could share with you, but it's something that every parent should have. In fact, I was hoping the school system would make this, when they give out their school handbook, they would give this to the students as well.
Is that Captain Maynard?
Yes, Maynard.
Captain Maynard. All right, the first question for you, Captain Maynard, is what is the process of internal investigation, and how long, this is kind of a two-part question, but I'm just going to ask it all together. What's the process of internal investigation, and how long can you be held for a traffic stop?
Okay. Well, I'll start out and break it down, if you don't mind, into the two questions. The first is, what is the process of an internal investigation? This is something I'm very, very familiar with. Not all law enforcement officers are familiar with it, and certainly our citizens are, so it's an excellent opportunity for me to help folks understand what the process is and how it goes. First, of course, is the complaint intake. So we receive complaints at the Sheriff's Office, and all law enforcement organizations receive complaints. They can come in any way, shape, or fashion. We don't restrict those complaints. They can come in via writing on our website. They can come in anonymously. They can come in via email. You can come in person. You can pick up the telephone. We don't restrict the method or the means with which we intake complaints. So any method that you have at your disposal will take your complaint. And we're obligated by policy to investigate each and every one. So we can't dismiss one. We can't look at one and say, no, I'm not going to investigate that one, but we're going to investigate this one. We don't have that luxury. We investigate them all. And all of our employees are authorized by policy. Not only are they authorized, they're commanded by policy to take a citizen complaint. So a deputy roadside can take a citizen complaint just the same as a commander within within the sheriff's office. An administrator can take a complaint. We all can take them. Once we intake those complaints, we determine what the severity of, because not all complaints are created equal. I think we would all agree that, and also let me backtrack just a little bit, not all complaints are external to the sheriff's office. Sometimes they're internal. Sometimes as a supervisor, I'm going to complain and lodge a complaint against one of my subordinates for being tardy for roll call. So many complaints are internal, some of which we discover on our own, and then of course some of which come in from citizens that we serve. So once a complaint comes in, we screen it and we determine whether or not it's a minor infraction or a very serious allegation. If it's a very serious allegation, those allegations are assigned to the Office of Professional Standards. That's where I work. I'm the chief inspector there. Otherwise, and more commonly known as internal affairs. Those are your serious allegations. Those are allegations of criminal conduct, sexual harassment, excessive use of force, anything that we can think of that would be very, very serious allegation. Informal allegations, or those that take a different route, are a little less serious. Well, perhaps the deputy or the police officer is being accused of being rude on a traffic stop. Arguably not nearly as serious as an excessive use of force complaint. Still something we need to look into, and we need to correct that behavior. Those are assigned at the division level. So they go to a division commander, typically the rank of captain, sometimes a lieutenant, and they're investigated at that level. Once the investigation takes place, which is the gathering of all evidence. It's a gathering of both physical evidence, it's a gathering of testimony, witness testimony, complainant testimony, and then lastly, the testimony of the subject employee themselves. So if I'm accused of something, we first interview everyone else and we gather all the information, and then we put the employee under oath. The employee does not have the luxury to not cooperate with us. They can't plead the fifth. They can't say, I don't want to cooperate with you, I don't want to talk to you. Their job is potentially on the line if they try to do that. Okay, so they're ordered by the sheriff to cooperate with these investigations. I won't get off into the weeds too much about things like garrity, but there are some dynamics there that are important. But I'll stick to just what I think is important for the citizens to know. Once we have a finding, okay, and the findings can range from exonerated all the way through sustained, which means the employee did what they're accused of having done. And the way we reach a sustained finding is a very, very low threshold, and the judge will certainly appreciate this. It's preponderance of the evidence. It's not probable cause, it's not beyond a reasonable doubt, it's preponderance of the evidence. A preponderance is more than 50%. So I'm accused of doing something, and the likelihood that I did what I'm accused of having done is greater than 50%. Does that make sense? A 50.1% chance that I did it, that we can have a sustained finding on that. That's a very, very low threshold. That benefits the citizens, okay? And it makes sure our officers and our deputy sheriffs are on notice that it really doesn't take a very high threshold to sustain a finding against them. So they best be minding their P's and Q's. Once we have that finding, it goes through the chain of command, and each person in the chain of command gets to make a recommendation on what the discipline should be. So if the person's sergeant, then the person's lieutenant, then the captain at the division level, and then ultimately to the sheriff. The sheriff is the judge. The sheriff has final say on the discipline. She considers three major factors. First and foremost, the recommendation of her commanders, because they're in the know. They know the employee, what the employee's past performance is, how many complaints have been against that employee, et cetera, et cetera. She then considers past precedents, because she doesn't want to give you 5 days suspension and then me for the same offense 1 day suspension. We have to remain consistent, just like we try to do in the criminal system. Remain as consistent as we can, because that's fair. And lastly, she considers the facts in the case. You know, she will read the case itself from beginning to end. And these cases they're very in-depth, and she'll read them and she'll render a finding of what her discipline is. Some types of discipline, depending on how severe they are, the employee is entitled to an appeal, and there's an appeal process. You can't appeal everything. Very low levels of discipline are not appealable. But if it involves termination, the employee is entitled to what's called a career service appeals board. or more than 2-day suspension, they're entitled to a Loudermill hearing. There is a Florida state statute that governs the way we do our investigation. So we don't just make this up, and it's not Sheriff Darnell's creation. It's created by statute, and that's Florida State Statute 112. And the Police Officer's Bill of Rights is contained therein in that statute. Again, that's Florida State Statute 112. Florida State Statute 112 says that all internal investigations must be completed within 180 days. We have 180 days to do that. Outside of that, we are violating the police officer's Bill of Rights, and the case is subject to dismissal. So we try very, very hard to make sure we're in as narrow a window as we can. Sheriff Darnell chooses, by policy, to restrict that even further. She says that I want these allegations investigated immediately. I want, an intense amount of resources put in them, and she restricts it to 45 days. So there's a huge difference between the 45 days she allows us and the 180 days that's allowed by law. That's good for the citizens. It's also good for our deputies and our police officers. No one wants to be accused of something and have it looming over their head. Even as a child, when I did things wrong, you want to be punished for it. You want to move on. Right? Guilty. Let's move on and talk about something else. I'm sure I'll screw something else up tomorrow, right? So it's good for everybody that that's the case. And then lastly, I'll finish that portion of the question. I'm sorry to be long-winded, but there's a lot to this. I'm going to seize this opportunity to put the information out. It's what's called the Criminal Justice and Standards and Training Commission. That is otherwise known as CJSTC. CJSTC is the governing body out of Tallahassee that gives me the power to be a police officer. They hold what's called our standards, or certificate, if you will. Because there is a state license to be a police officer. Not just anybody can do it. And if for certain types of offenses, and they're called, it's escaping me, moral character violations, untruthfulness, excessive use of force, any type of criminal conduct, those are automatically by law reported to the Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission, and they have a board who reviews those, and they can revoke my standards. So if I'm accused of criminal conduct and I can commit a law violation, I can not only lose my job here locally, but I can lose my ability to ever be a police officer ever again. And it used to be just for the state of Florida, but the CJSTC is now working cooperatively with the other states. And there's only 2 states in the United States that currently, if I lose my standards here, that I can go be a police officer someplace else. One of those is Michigan, just as a side note. So unfortunately, bad police officers in Florida can still go to Michigan and be a police officer. Those things need to be tidied up, and that needs to be fixed. What was the second part of your question?
The second part of the question was, how long can you, we've been hearing a lot about this in the news, I believe the law changed just recently. How long can you be held for a traffic stop?
Yeah, I just noticed something. There's something I want to go back and talk about the other, but I'll answer that portion of the question first. How long can you be held on a traffic stop? There is no, and I'm going to get off in the weeds here a little bit, but there is no finite number, okay? There's no magic number. There's nothing in a rule book or handbook that says 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. A person can only be lawfully detained by a law enforcement officer for a threshold that's called reasonable suspicion, okay? And that's a pretty low threshold, but it's based on what I'll read you the definition. Sometimes that's the best way. Here's how it's defined by statute. Reasonable suspicion, suspicion that is more than a mere hunch, but is based on a set of articulable facts and circumstances that would warn a person of reasonable caution in believing that a violation of the law has been committed, is about to be committed, or is in the process of being committed by the person or persons under suspicion. It can be based on observations of the law enforcement officer combined with their training and experience and/or reliable information received from credible outside sources. Okay, so it has to be more than a mere hunch before we can lawfully detain you. And then we can detain you for the purposes of conducting an investigation. That's a traffic stop. That's a stop on the roadside stop on the side of the road where we're interviewing you. Those sort of things. Reasonable suspicion allows us only the amount of time that's reasonable to investigate the reason for the detention in the beginning, or it also allows us additional time if that initial stop transcends into something else. Here's an example. I pull you over, sir, for running a red light. After pulling you over for running a red light, you fail to produce identification. Now we have another matter to investigate, correct? I